Burnaby, New Westminster.
Madam Speaker, I appreciate having you in the chair today. And this is a pretty fundamental debate that we're having. Unfortunately, the motion really doesn't address the issues that we as Canadians and as Canadian parliamentarians must address. What it does do, Madam Speaker, is put in very stark relief the two ends of this House of Commons. As you know, Madam Speaker, on one end we have the Liberal-Conservative coalition crossing over the aisle, which is essentially a group of flamboyant and radical free traders. They've read in the textbook that free trade is good, so they don't take any sort of intervention of government, any sort of managed trade, any actual policies that would lead to job development or industrial strategies in this country. That's what we've seen over the last 20 years, and many Canadians know that what that has led to is a collapse of our manufacturing industry, collapse of many of our strategic industries, and as I'll point to a little bit later on, Madam Speaker, actually a fall in real income for most Canadians. You would think that these radical free traders would actually look to see if the economic theories that they've learned in the textbook actually work. But no, there's no evaluation, no real consistent understanding of the impact that these policies have had. Madam Speaker, that's unfortunate. We know the Prime Minister never actually run a business, never met a payroll, but learned his economics from textbooks. And it shows, Madam Speaker, because this government has been appallingly short-sighted in putting into place industrial strategies for the automobile sector, for the steel sector, for our shipbuilding sector, for softwood lumber, for a whole range of industries, vital industries, strategic industries. We've seen the loss of real jobs. And it has been in part because we have not had a trade strategy that makes any sense. On the other end of this House, Madam Speaker, as you well know, stretching across both aisles now as a result of the new members we earned in the last election, is the New Democratic Party. We are strong, fair traders, Madam Speaker. We believe that what trade needs to do is generate additional employment and jobs, but that the government, the people of the country, have a role in ensuring that there are industrial strategies put into place, that we're preserving and enhancing the automobile sector, preserving and enhancing our steel industry, preserving and enhancing our softwood lumber industry, preserving and enhancing our shipbuilding industry. We believe that government has a role working with the private sector, the public sector, working together, a mixed economic development to ensure that there is a real rise in real income for most Canadians. Madam Speaker, and perhaps nothing draws us more in relief than this motion that we see today, the difference between fair traders and radical free traders. Well, Madam Speaker, j'aimerais juste pointer.
I'd just like to underscore some of the New Democrats' approach as far as fair trade is concerned before I turn to specific aspects. The New Democrats believe that fair trade factors in human rights, women's rights, and so on and so forth, environmental concerns. So trade should be a way of promoting these rights and addressing inequalities between men and women. It should be a way of strengthening human rights and not lessening them, which is what this government is doing and what the previous government did. Just like with the Colombia-Canada agreement, it will, in fact, diminish human rights. Now, by honouring free trade associations, just like with supply management that our farmers are relying on throughout this country and our communities are relying on to advance local economies, we believe that we need to support these fair traders, and the other parties don't believe this. And also there are agreements to respect the environment and sustainable development. And that's a glaring difference between the Conservative Liberal coalition and the NDP. Free trade agreements have managed to skirt environmental regulations. Many companies and businesses have found ways of getting around environmental rules and regulations that the vast majority of Canadians support. So clearly, fair trade agreements must help to promote human rights and respect for the environment. Fair trade agreements also honour economic diversity. There's a third sector, the public and the private sector, but also the cooperative sector, which is a community that works hard on behalf of communities so that communities can take charge of themselves, flourish and develop. There are many examples of the cooperative communities' strengths that I could give you that have strengthened local and regional the economic situation of those local and regional areas. The Conservatives and the Liberals are now in cahoots. They have the same approach when it comes to trade, and they believe in one single approach, and that is the approach of big business that can get around regulations. Of course, they want to stimulate the economy, but it leads to it does not strengthen community ties and local ties if you put all your eggs in one basket, you see.
We have here the issue of this particular motion. In light of that difference between Liberals and Conservatives, who are perfectly happy selling out Canadian jobs, and the NDP, who believes firmly in reinforcing our economy, reinforcing our vital industries like the automotive sector, like the softwood lumber sector, like shipbuilding. I could go on and on, but there is a very clear difference in our approaches. So we have this motion today that has three elements, and I'd like to touch each one of them. Unfortunately, some of them are factually wrong. It's too bad, but it's a fairly innocuous motion, and we'll have to decide in the next few days how we take all this together. The first element is in view of the growing protectionism in the U.S., which is reminiscent of the counterproductive behavior that led to the Great Depression in the 1930s. In this sense, the Liberal motion changes history, unfortunately, Madam Speaker. Now, I think they're referring to Smoot-Hawley back in the early 1930s. And radical free traders, these theoretical folks who just love to look at their textbooks and say, well, this theory will have to work without ever checking on the consequences of their action. Well, they say that Smoot-Hawley was the cause of the Great Depression. Well, Madam Speaker, that's simply not true. Smoot-Hawley came as a result of the Great Depression, which has already started. Essentially, the Great Depression, in part, came from a lack of regulation. Does that sound familiar, Madam Speaker? Well, of course it does. I'd like to cite one of our international colleagues, the Labour Party, part of the same international that the NDP is part of, and the new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who said, "The time has come, off the back of the current crisis, to proclaim that the great neoliberal experiment of the past 30 years has failed, that the emperor has no clothes." And Prime Minister Rudd is referring to the fact that a lack of regulation, again, has put us back in the same kind of economic circumstances that we saw in the 1930s. Smoot-Hawley wasn't the cause. Smoot-Hawley was a right-wing Republican attempt to deal with a crisis that began with no regulations, no protections in place for the public across North America. And curiously, Madam Speaker, this particular motion doesn't refer to what the antidote was for the Great Depression, which was not only a series of regulations to put in place to protect the public, but also, Madam Speaker, what the NDP has always been calling for, the great economic stimulus that came out of the New Deal. That was missing from the Republican approach. There was no economic stimulus. There was no investment. And what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did with the New Deal was provide that economic stimulus that the NDP has been pushing now for months, convinced our Liberal partners to come on the majority coalition, and then they sold us out, went with the Conservatives. Anyhow, Madam Speaker, we'll see if the Conservatives can be trusted to bring in that economic stimulus in a fair and effective way. Many of us don't believe that they can be trusted. Certainly they've broken their word before. But the point I'm making, Madam Speaker, is that it was economic stimulus in the New Deal that actually started to push the United States out of the Great Depression. So the first clause is factually wrong. That's, I guess, in keeping with the proud liberal tradition. But it's, aside from that factual error, perhaps pretty innocuous. So secondly, we have that this House calls upon the government to intervene forthwith and persistently with the United States administration and the Congress in order to protect Canadian jobs. Well, that's something certainly that we could support, Madam Speaker. That is something that we've been pushing for. But let me preface my remarks in this regard with what is actually happening in the United States and in Canada. Madam Speaker, since NAFTA was implemented in 1989, we have the figures right here. What's happened is a hollowing out of Canada. Essentially, for most Canadians, they've lost in real income. We've seen a loss in real income that's the equivalent for the lowest 20% of the Canadian population of about a month and a half of income. In real terms, they've lost a month and a half income since NAFTA was implemented. For the lower middle class, they've lost about 2 weeks of income for each and every Canadian family in that income class, which we're talking about more than 6 million Canadians in those families. They've lost about 2 weeks of income in real terms. And the middle class has lost about a week of income in real terms for each and every year since NAFTA was implemented. Now, this isn't solely a cause of NAFTA. It's also because of all of the foolish economic and lack of economic policies that were put in by the Liberals, like the Conservatives. They don't seem to change much as they bounce across the floor. But fundamentally, we can say that on the bottom line, they have failed over the past 20 years. When most Canadian families are earning less in real terms than they were 20 years ago, Madam Speaker, you would think that one member of the Conservative Liberal Party would say, well, gee, maybe we should change our economic approach. Well, Madam Speaker, what the NDP is saying is, with a growing number of Canadians, they're saying, since Liberals and Conservatives aren't changing their economic approach, we're looking to change the government. And that's why we're seeing more and more New Democrats in this House of Commons as we go through each election, Madam Speaker. Because we understand that this is not sustainable. When you're saying to the middle class, accept less every year, when you're saying to the poorest Canadians, accept much less every year, that is simply not a sustainable economic policy. And, Madam Speaker, I'll just conclude remarks on the Canadian income categories by saying now that the wealthiest 20%, which is what these economic policies have been intended to do, this not a flood upwards, the wealthiest 20% now take most Canadian income. Canadian income pie is less and less equal, more and more skewed to corporate lawyers and to corporate CEOs. And, Madam Speaker, that is why the NDP is saying we need a much more balanced approach, a much more mature approach, that in keeping with what we're seeing around the world. So, Madam Speaker, we're saying in this motion that we want to intervene with the United States administration. Now, the important thing to note is when we're talking to President Obama and talking to Americans, we have to understand that they are going through exactly the same thing. And I'd like to cite two right-wing, radical free traders who said in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs, this is Kenneth Sheaf and Matthew Slaughter, who has the oxymoronic title of being a former economic policy advisor to George Bush. They said, these are free traders, saying that income inequality in the United States is greater today than at any time since the 1920s. Less than 4% of workers were in educational groups that enjoyed increases in mean real money earnings from 2000 to 2005. Mean real money earnings rose for workers with doctorates and professional graduate degrees, lawyers, corporate CEOs, and fell for all other income categories. That's nearly 97% of Americans saw their real income go down, Madam Speaker. These explanations around the issue of so-called protectionism miss a basic point. U.S. policy is becoming more protectionist because the American public is becoming more protectionist, and this shift in attitude is a result of stagnant and falling incomes. Madam Speaker, it's no secret why President Obama was elected on a platform of renegotiating NAFTA. rebuilding it on a fair trade model. It's no secret why we've seen in the United States, both in the House of Representatives, I was on the phone to the U.S. Congress yesterday talking to friends of mine in the U.S. Congress who are talking about these issues, the Senate rejecting Senator McCain's ridiculous amendment in the Senate, or certainly not an amendment that was in keeping with the way most American senators felt, rejected 65 to 31. It's because Americans are increasingly concerned about the same income fall that they have seen, that we have seen. So if we are intervening with the United States administration, we have to start on that basis. We have to start on the basis that these free trade agreements and all the economic right-wing policy that have gone with it has not been good for American workers, and it has not been good for Canadian workers, Madam Speaker. That is the fundamental problem. And I would hope that at least one of our colleagues from the Conservative or Liberal parties would actually start to look at the real facts, the bottom line, not the textbook theory. We all know the textbook theory. I can spout the textbook theory as well as anyone in this House. But the real practical results are a fall in real income for Canadians, a fall in real income for Americans. And that is why we're having to deal with these issues where more and more workers are saying, we've got to protect jobs here at home. So, Madam Speaker, then how do we communicate with the United States administration and Congress? Well, we can do it on a win-win basis. Madam Speaker, I'll cite the figures, the most recent figures available. November 2008, for Canadian trade with the U.S. from iron and steel mills, targeted, as you know, Madam Speaker, in the House of Representatives bill and targeted as well in the Senate bill. And they're going to go into conference, but one can assume that iron and steel is going to get through that conference, and we're going to have to contend with this and deal with the administration and the American Senate and Congress in a meaningful way. Well, in November 2008, we exported to the U.S. $349 million worth of iron and steel. We imported from the United States $401 million, Madam Speaker. In other words, the U.S. has a deficit with us, a trade deficit in iron and steel, that essentially means that we buy more iron and steel from them than they buy from us. November 2008, essentially, that's what those figures mean. So, Madam Speaker, what that means is that we have an opportunity for win-win. We have an opportunity to go with the American administration, American senators, American members of Congress, and say, we would like to exempt from a Buy Canada clause American steel so we can use American iron and steel. And we'd like you to do the same with the Buy America clause. Just one wrinkle, Madam Speaker, just one tiny wrinkle. Over the last 20 years, Liberal inaction and of Conservative inaction, neither government chose at any time, we talked about the lack of industrial strategies, they didn't even bother to put in place the Buy Canada clause, Madam Speaker, and that is something the NDP has been pushing, and that again, Madam Speaker, is why there are more and more New Democrats in this House as we go through each election. That's why we overflow from one side to the other side of this House now. It's because Canadians are saying, why didn't Liberals bring this in? Why aren't Conservatives bringing in a Buy Canada clause? Well, I'll come to they're going to say, well, it simply must be illegal or it's not in keeping with our textbook theory. But, Madam Speaker, the reality is this would provide us with the leverage that we need to sit down with the American administration and having a win-win negotiation exempt our iron and steel in the same way that we can exempt theirs. Now, I come to the third part of the motion, Madam Speaker, which is urge the United States to respect its international agreements. And I'm going to cite just a couple of articles, Madam Speaker. First, from the United Steelworkers, the Canadian Director, Ken Newman, and the International Steelworker President, Leo Gerard, a very proud Canadian. He says, the U.S. has had, Ken Newman says, the U.S. has had laws requiring the use of domestically produced goods for government contracts since the 1933 Buy American Act. These laws are consistent with international trade obligations. Linda DeBelle says the same thing in the Toronto Star. Madam Speaker, Buy Canada is legal. Buy America is legal for provincial and municipal entities as it is for state and municipal entities. And instead, we are sending millions of dollars of taxpayers' dollars to buy overseas what we could be building here at home. Many people have cited the Navistar plant, where we're spending a $274 million contract for military contracts in Texas when we, as taxpayers, provided $65 million to the Navistar plant in Chatham, Ontario. Madam Speaker, it does not make sense, this approach, a purely theoretical approach that we're not going to have Buy Canada because it interferes with our theoretical approach on free trade. It is legal, Madam Speaker. It would create more jobs in Canada, and that is why the NDP is pressing this government and its Liberal colleagues to put in place a Buy Canada policy and save Canadian jobs. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member from Kings House.
Speaker, we just heard from the Honourable Member that President Obama is wrong to recognize the risk, the protectionist risk of Buy America provisions in the stimulus bill, that Senator McCain was wrong to try to remove the Buy America protectionist clause from the bill. And we heard from the NDP that, in fact, we'd be better off to bring in similar measures in Canada to in fact, we should be supporting the American Buy America program, which does discriminate against Canadian-made goods. But we should also do our own and work together to more deeply integrate the Canada-U.S. economies, which is interesting coming from the NDP. But beyond that, Mr. Speaker, doesn't he recognize the risk around the world of countries retaliating against Canada and the U.S. if we both engage in that kind of globophobic, socialist, Luddite, protectionist measure that every other social democratic party in the world, except Canada's New Democrats, has rejected? Doesn't he realize that we would start, instead of it being a U.S. Smoot-Hawley, this would be a Canada-U.S. Smoot-Hawley approach, but it would provoke exactly the same kind of economic devastation and economic downturn globally, particularly deleterious to the Canadian and then the U.S. economies?
The Honourable Member from Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, Madam Speaker, is that all he has? I mean, the same kind of conservative, theoretical rhetoric? Come on. Madam Speaker, I expected to have a real debate, and that's all he's got. It's going to be an utter calamity if Canada does what's legal under trade agreements. Now, the Senate, I'm sorry to have to announce this to the member, but he should have been following this. The Senate just adopted the language on iron and steel provisions, the Buy America Act, and also reiterated that essentially it is within trade agreements. As the member should know, my goodness, he's the trade critic for the Liberal Party. He should know this stuff. This is pretty fundamental. Conservatives should know this too, but they're trade illiterates, Madam Speaker. They simply don't understand. So the Buy Malaysia, the Buy Korean, the Buy European, all these clauses that exist are legal, Madam Speaker, and yet they don't bring them in. Is it because they're illiterate? Is it because they're uninformed? Is it just because they don't understand trade? Is it because they're asleep, Madam Speaker? I have no idea, but time after time after time, we're told it's legal, and time after time after time, Liberals and Conservatives say, no, if we do that, the whole world will explode. No, it won't, Madam Speaker, but more Canadians will have jobs, and more Canadians will be able to contribute to their local economy, and more Canadians will be off employment insurance or off welfare and be able to contribute the way they want to Canada. If Conservatives and Liberals understood fair trade and understood that Buy Canada is legal, more Canadians would be prosperous. It's a shame they don't understand, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton, Millwoods, Beaumont.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Interesting to hear the rant from the Honourable Member. Speaking of understanding, I understand from your speech that you quoted that middle-income Canadians have lost 10% of real income, and you said, quote unquote, or he said, quote unquote, for each and every year since NAFTA was implemented. Now, near as I can tell, that would result in a 200% negative or 100% negative real income for middle-income Canadians. So I'd like to sort of understand, you didn't document, or he didn't document where he got those numbers from. I'd like to hear where he got the numbers from. Secondly, curious, we're the honourable member's promoting a Buy Canada solution to everything. Now, by extension, I would imagine that he would be even stronger in favour of a Buy BC provision, or perhaps a Buy Burnaby provision in terms of trade. Maybe he would like to go back to the days when families made their own clothes, grew their own food, and build their own homes. Perhaps that would be the solution to the problems that we're facing right now.
Honourable member from Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, thanks, Madam Speaker. I'll deal with the serious question first, and then the silly question afterwards. Serious question, Library of Parliament. It's StatsCan from 1989 to 2005. I'll bring the figures another way, because what I was saying was if you've lost a week's income, that has a cumulative effect. If you lose a week, and over 20 years, you've earned a less 1 week for each one of those 20 years. Cumulatively, you lose more income. I was trying to explain it in a very simple way so that Conservatives and Liberals can understand. But another way of explaining it is that the loss of real income growth for the lowest quintile has been 14%. For the second quintile has been 12%. This is in real terms. For the third quintile has been 6%. That is a loss, an average loss, for all the 6 million Canadians within that income category. That's horrendous, Madam Speaker. Now, the sillier question, I think, is something that I'll just come back to in saying, again, one more time, for Liberals and Conservatives in this House, Buy Canada provisions are legal. Virtually every other industrialized country in the world has them, including the United States, and they are going to be investing in economic stimulus through a completely legal process. So the question that I have to put back to every single Liberal and Conservative in this House is, why are you refusing to protect Canadian jobs with a strategy that is legal under NAFTA and the WTO?
Questions and comments? L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Personally, I loved the intervention made by my colleague for Burnaby, New Westminster. I thought that most of his ideas are quite intelligent, personally. The depression in the 30s was because of the lack of control by the state on economic levers, and what is happening today is exactly the same thing. Also, he said that the Buy Canada Act is something legal that has never been implemented by the Conservatives or the Liberals and should have been implemented. So I share his idea on that. However, those points are something that will have to be debated at some other time, because today we have to respond to Mr. Obama, who will be coming to visit us to talk about his plan. We will be meeting with him shortly, and I'd like to remind my colleague and my colleague for Sherbrooke, who explained the various elements earlier that are part of the Obama plan and that could lead to legal challenges. We know that when it comes to commercial or trade challenges, even when the Americans think they're right, they allow a challenge and they let it drag through the courts for years and years until those who are involved either die or simply are chased away from the market, if you will. Mr. Parizeau said that when a mouse sleeps with an elephant has to know where that mouse is. It's important for the mouse. So this is my question for my colleague. If his party leader meets with Mr. Obama shortly, could he tell him where exactly that mouse is located? The honourable member for Burnaby, New Westminster, has about 1 minute 30 seconds.
Je remercie mon collègue.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. Indeed, what I was trying to explain to the Liberals and to the Conservatives is that Mr. Obama has a mandate from the American people to maintain American jobs and increase the real income, which has dropped considerably over the past 20 years, and particularly over the past 5 years. Even the most fervent fans of George Bush agree on that and admit it. So what we need to tell them is that We understand your concern. We also have concerns. Instead of calling upon far-fetched theories of pure free trade that the Conservatives and the Liberals like to explain, we need something very real that we can negotiate when it comes to steel and iron. We should say that we need some type of managed trade between the two countries so that we can win on the Canadian side, and the Americans will come out winners as well. This will help our steel and iron industries. Resuming debate.